the Great Society, and the drive for black equality. Lyndon B. Johnson had a vision for America, believing that problems of housing, income, employment, and health were ultimately a federal responsibility. Johnson used the weight of the presidency and his formidable political skills to enact the most impressive array of reform legislation since the days of Franklin Roosevelt. He envisioned a society without poverty or discrimination, in which all Americans enjoyed equal educational and job opportunities. He called his vision the Great Society. A major feature of Johnson's Great Society was the war on poverty. The federal government raised the minimum wage and enacted programs to train poor Americans for new and better jobs, including the Manpower Development and Training Act and the Economic Opportunity Act, which established such programs as the Job Corps and the Neighborhood Youth Corps in 1964. To assure adequate housing, in 1966, Congress adopted the Model Cities Act to attack urban blight, set up a cabinet-level Department of Housing and Urban Development, and began a program of rent supplements. To promote education, Congress passed the Higher Education Act in 1965 to provide student loans and scholarships, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act in 1965 to pay for textbooks, and the Educational Opportunity Act in 1968 to help the poor finance college education. To address the nation's health needs, the Child Health Improvement and Protection Act in 1968 provided for prenatal and postnatal care. The Medicaid Act in 1968 paid for the medical expenses of the poor. And Medicare, established in 1965, extended medical insurance to older Americans under the Social Security system. Johnson also prodded Congress to pass a broad spectrum of civil rights laws, ranging from the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to the Fair Housing Act barring discrimination in the sale or rental of housing in 1968. In 1965, LBJ issued an executive order requiring government contractors to ensure that job applicants and employees were not discriminated against. It required all contractors to prepare an affirmative action plan to achieve these goals. Johnson broke many other color barriers. In 1966, he named the first black cabinet member and appointed the first black woman to the federal bench. In 1967, he appointed Thurgood Marshall to become the first black American to serve on the Supreme Court. The first Southerner to reside in the White House in half a century, Johnson showed a stronger commitment to improving the position of black Americans than any previous president. When President Johnson announced his Great Society program in 1964, he promised substantial reductions in the number of Americans living in poverty. When he left office, he could legitimately argue that he had delivered on his promise. In 1960, 40 million Americans, 20% of the population, were classified as poor. By 1969, their number had fallen to 24 million, 12% of the population. Johnson also pledged to qualify the poor for new and better jobs, to extend health insurance to the poor and elderly to cover hospital and doctor costs, and to provide better housing for low-income families. Here, too, Johnson could say he had delivered. Infant mortality among the poor, which had barely declined between 1950 and 1965, fell by one-third in the decade after 1965 as a result of expanded federal medical and nutritional programs. Before 1965, 20% of the poor had never seen a doctor. By 1970, the figure had been cut to 8%. The proportion of families living in houses lacking indoor plumbing also declined steeply, from 20% in 1960 to 11% a decade later. Although critics argue that Johnson took a shotgun approach to reform and pushed poorly thought out bills through Congress, supporters responded that at least Johnson tried to move toward a more compassionate society. During the 1960s, median black family income rose 53%, black employment in professional, technical, and clerical occupations doubled, and average black educational attainment increased by 4 years. The proportion of blacks below the poverty line fell from 55% in 1960 to 27% in 1968. The black unemployment rate fell 34%. The country had taken major strides toward extending equality of opportunity to black Americans. In addition, the number of whites below the poverty line dropped dramatically, and such poverty-plagued regions as Appalachia made significant economic strides. Copyright 2021 Digital History.